The annual Global Development Awards competition grants 2 awards to recognise excellence in policy-oriented research and innovative social development projects. The Japanese Award for Outstanding Research and Development supports the research capacity development of researchers in low and middle-income countries. And the Japanese Award for Most Innovative Development Project funds social development projects benefiting marginalised groups in developing countries. Run by the Global Development Network since 2000, roughly $4 million has been granted to researchers and social initiatives around the world. The Global Development Awards competition recently celebrated its 20th year, and the impact of these 20 years is demonstrated in the competition's independent impact reports. The grants have a positive impact on research skills, career advancement, and follow-up funding. And the majority of research papers from grantees have been recognised nationally or internationally for their quality. The grants help to increase professional network collaborations and tend to exceed the expectations of organisations and individuals and enable skill development. The professional growth of the grantees increases visibility and recognition among research, policymaking and NGO circles, as well as stimulating further projects, publications and funding. The awards offer a platform for participants, both researchers and NGOs, to increase their networks and project recognition to national and international audiences, and the winners often see national and international replication of their research or development projects.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Francesco Vino, and I'm Director of Research and Programs at the Global Development Network. And I'm very happy to welcome everyone. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone to the finals of the Global Development Awards competition, and specifically its 2022 edition. As you've seen in the video, this award competition has two tracks of awards. So today we will be having the finals for the Outstanding Research on Development Awards, and tomorrow at the same time we'll be having the finals for the Most Innovative Development Project Award. Let me just share a few information about this program of GDN, which is actually the longest standing program of the Global Development Network, and I'll just share my screen to run you through a few slides. Okay. The program has been running since 2000. As I said, this is one of the longest running programs of the Global Development Network, and of course, as a consequence, also one of the largest. It is launched and managed by the Global Development Network, but thanks to funding from the Policy and Human Resource Development Fund at the World Bank, and funded by the Ministry of Finance of the government in Japan, whom we thank for the generous support. Over the years, so over the last over 2 decades, we awarded around $4 million in research and implementation grants across the world, where over 100 grants we awarded in the past. The uniqueness of this program is that it's of course an award, but it's also a grant, right? So we don't stop at the award. So the teams and the projects that will be awarded today will actually receive funding and will be accompanied in the use of those funds to implement the projects. This specific track of the award is, of course, a research grant, so Outstanding Research and Development, and includes 3 prizes for an overall amount of $60,000. So the first prize will get $30,000, and the second prize $20,000, and the third prize $10,000. This is a grant, as I said. It's more than just an award. It's a grant, which means that we interact with and we work with the grantees and the awardees over the entire implementation of the project and beyond. So there's a number of opportunities that we offer our ORDs. Of course, there are a number of webinars and trainings that we offer before the finals. In fact, before today, including training on how to pitch and communicate the project. But we also pair the awardees with specialists in the area that will actually accompany the implementation as dependent advisors during the whole duration of the research project. A feature we're introducing this year, and we're very proud to have gotten this far, is that we're going to link the research award with the implementation award, because we think that the interactions between the ORD winners, so the researchers, and the MIDP winners is absolutely precious, and we want to work on the link between research and implementation and knowledge and practice. So there'll be an additional top-up grant for those researchers who are interested in working with the winners of the competition track that will be decided on tomorrow. We also work long-term with our researchers and try to remain in touch with them and connect them, facilitate the connections across editions through a global network. And you'll be able to visualize this network on our website, looking for the Global Development Awards competition platform, with over 104 grantees, plus the ones we'll be selecting today. Just a few words on the process we follow for selecting the winners. We of course issue global calls on a specific topic that changes every year. This year we had 31 projects that were considered eligible after the eligibility check, which is something we do internally at GDN. And as soon as that is done, the projects go, in fact, through 2 rounds of external reviews. And the unique feature of this competition is that the first round of reviews is done by young and mid-career researchers, while the second is done by senior researchers with specific expertise in the topic of the call, and that the researchers have a chance to receive, they actually have access to the reviews from the first round, and have a chance to actually rework and slightly the projects. So we integrated a capacity building kind of measure within the selection process itself. We are today at the finals, which means that the top three projects have been invited to present today in front of a jury of top global experts on the topic in a public session. So this is a public session open obviously to the public, and the end of which we will identify the 3 winners. One thing we're quite proud of is that this year we managed to shift the track record on the balance between male and female applicants. So we have, we had about 55% of our eligible applicants were female, and about 30% of the long-listed applicants were also led by female researchers. And we did this just by signaling our encouraging and signaling our interest in projects led by female researchers, and this worked. It just proves that any organization can actually do the same. We're a bit worried about past years where sometimes all 3 finalists were in fact projects led by male researchers. A couple of words very quickly, because if you are connected, it means you read up on this year's competition and you have seen the call. This year, so for the edition of 2022, we decided to focus, of course, on post-COVID-19 scenarios, and specifically on governance. And the kind of question we thought would be useful to ask, where in fact, to what extent pre-existing policy processes and governance arrangements were pandemic ready. Right? When the pandemic hit. The obvious answer based on common knowledge is obviously they were not pandemic ready, but I think we need to understand why and how they were not. We're also interested to know how policy processes in governance changed through the pandemic, due to the pandemic, and of course, who was most affected by this trend and these changes. I'd like to before I present the full jury, I'd like to invite the chair of the jury, who's Dr. Izumi Ono, to say a few words. Let me just introduce her quickly. So Dr. Izumi Ono is a professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, in Japan. And she's also a senior research advisor at JICA Ogata Sadoko Research Institute for Peace and Development, which she directed a few years ago. She's been a great supporter of the competition, so we thank her again for her time and availability. Ono-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you very much for all the participants for this very important session. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Izumi Ono, and I'm very honored to participate in this competition as the chair of the jury and also share a few words with you. First of all, I would like to extend our sincere appreciation to the organizer of GDN 2022 Global Development Award. And also, I would like to thank you so much for the excellent jury members for collaborating, for sharing their excellent knowledge with us. This GDN has always led a trend of times, and the theme of the 2022 award is post-COVID-19 governance, learning from the challenging circumstances to build better governance system. The COVID pandemic brought devastating socio-economic consequences to our society and reminded us of the importance of resilient and inclusive governance. On the top of COVID, the world is now facing multiple crises, such as climate changes, conflict and war, energy and food crisis, natural disaster, etc. And these crises are having particularly serious impacts on vulnerable population. In this age of such multiple crises, the concept of human security, which we think that the protection for the vulnerable people from fear and risks, and also empowering them with dignity is very much important. And JICA advocates for this human security concept as its main mission, and also research arm of JICA, the Ogata Research Institute, Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development, which I am also affiliated with as a senior research advisor, recently published its flagship report, Human Security Today, in order to investigate the state of human security and explain its significance in changing times. In this regard, we are very honored and happy to see this year's competition is focusing on this impact of COVID for better governance issues. So I think we really think it is very important to share our knowledge and solution for sustainable development. And this year's finalists also prepare excellent proposal that approach to this issue from research perspective. And 3 of the 2022 award is worth to discuss not only with leading scholars, but also with young researchers. Therefore, the competition is a very good opportunity for all of us. With 20 years of this continuous implementation, as Francisco already said, the Japanese award competition for outstanding research on development has proven to be successful in promoting high-quality research on development issues. And many of the award winners in the past made significant achievement and contributed to GDN's mission using the prize and the GDN mentorship effectively. So I am very proud of this achievement. So also on behalf of the Japanese Ministry of Finance, not only JICA, Ogata Research Institute, which support this award, I would like to thank you all the applicants, especially the finalists of the award. I would also like to thank distinguished members of the selection committee jury for your commitment and dedication. So let's start. Now it's time to move on the competition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ono-san, for your kind words. Of course, let me just present the other members of the panel very briefly, of the jury. Sorry. if you can see my screen, yes, and then we'll move on to the core of the session. So along with Ono-san, who's of course the chair of the jury, we have 3 other distinguished jury members. So Adebayo Olukoshi, who's a distinguished professor at Wits School of Governance in South Africa. He's also a ISC International Science Council Fellow, a member of the Standing Committee for Science Planning for 2022 to 2025. We have Alina Rocha Menocal, who's the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice at the University of Birmingham, and a senior research fellow and a principal at the policy practice again at the University of Birmingham, and has a long history, of course, at ODI as well. And then we have Professor Francisco Ferreira, who's currently Amartya Sen Professor of Inequality Studies and the director of the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics, and I should mention also a past board member of, I should mention proudly, a past board member of GDN. Now, how will the rest of the session run? We'll have the 3 researchers, the 3 finalists, present the project for 15 minutes each. After each presentation, we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers from the jury and from the audience. So I'll be moderating the discussion. So I'll give the floor to the researchers one by one, and then after each presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So for those of you who are connected online, as audience, a general audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and of course I'll be picking up questions from the jury as they raised their hands. Without further ado, I think we can move on with the first presentation of today. And I believe the first presentation is by Christo Gorpudolo for the project titled Post-COVID-19 Governance, Emerging Trends, Resilience and Lessons for Public Emergency in Sub-Saharan Africa, a case study of Liberia. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. 50 minutes.
Hello, and thank you, Georges. Before we continue talking in detail about the research proposal, I want to take you on a trip to West Africa, to a country called Liberia. This country shares a border in its north with Guinea, in the south with the Atlantic Ocean, in the east with Ivory Coast, and in the west with Sierra Leone. The country has 15 counties, and there are 16 languages spoken across the country, traditional or tribal languages spoken across the country. It has a square mile of approximately 400,000. Next. This West African country called Liberia, with its population of 5.2 million people, has only 920 doctors and 53 oxygen tanks, as well as less than 20% of its population in the capital, which is Monrovia, having access to electricity, and it has a doctor-to-patient ratio of 1 doctor to 20,000 people. And in order to access a healthcare center, you have to walk about 5 km to access a healthcare center. Now, how prepared that healthcare center is to handle your case is another story when you are on the ground. There is no pre-disaster policy, although the country has been struck twice. The country is no stranger to disastrous diseases. The country was part of the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014, and it bear the brunt of the burns when it comes to death, although the country was not the epicenter of the Ebola virus disease. Next. In response to this call, and based on the vulnerabilities that I have mentioned, the project has been designed, this proposal has been designed with the following aim and objective. The team want to investigate governance and policy challenges that is faced by least developed countries, in this case specifically Liberia. The project team also want to unearth some of the challenges that has been triggered in public governance following the outbreak of COVID-19. The team will investigate what new actors that have emerged based or due to the outbreak of COVID-19. More aim and objectives include getting deeper, understanding some resulting pattern of post-COVID-19 governance within Liberia and new and amended rules within the post-COVID-19 landscape that have emerged or been amended based on the outbreak of COVID-19. Next. For this research, Liberia has been chosen as a case because of the following reason. First, Liberia is highly understudied. So a lot is not known about the country in terms of disaster governance. Thus, the potential to learn and get new insight within the entire disaster disease governance spectrum is very high or promising. And there's also a far broader spectrum of governance and policy challenges that the country offers, a broad spectrum of valuable lessons that can be learned. And this Liberia has also suffered and withstood two major health or disease outbreaks, successive one. So we had the Ebola virus disease in 2014 and then COVID-19 in 2019. So the country presents very good and rich lessons that can be learned when it comes to disaster disease control, as well as challenges that have been faced by least developed countries in relation to disaster or disease governance. So the country, based on those factors, Liberia has been chosen as the case that will be investigated, and then findings from there could be replicated or adopted in other least developed countries. Next. In order to achieve the project aim and objective, we have as a team designed two main research questions. So the first is, how has COVID-19 transformed Liberia's policy landscape in the areas of education, health, and social welfare? And the last is, what impact have these transformations have on governance in Liberia? So these two questions will allow the team investigate the very minute details of policy landscape in the country, and then the broader spectrum of governance when it comes to policy and disaster governance within the country. Next. So the team starts the research from an informed point of view. We know that in Africa, there were fewer number of deaths recorded based on COVID-19, and that could be for various reasons. So Africa recorded a fewer number of deaths in comparison to other parts of the world, like the United States, China, and Europe. However, although Africa recorded fewer number of deaths, the continent did not escape the burns when it comes to public governance, accountability, or social economic factor. So these were the sectors that were greatly affected due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next. We have highlighted two cases, one from Zimbabwe and the other from Democratic Republic of Congo. On the screen, you see some of the issues that were unearthed due to COVID-19 pandemic, and these issues are also issues that have been unearthed in Liberia due to COVID-19 pandemic. Next. So in Liberia, we saw community organizing at its peak, as was seen in 2014 during the Ebola outbreak. So members of the community Usually they come together and then go out with these preventive messages and how the virus spread and how you can keep yourself safe. So that was again seen in Liberia in 2019. The outbreak of COVID-19. Other issues that are seen is that delay in uncoordinated government interventions led to ineffective public health policies. So instead of issues being or interventions being coordinated, they were rather sporadic and uncoordinated, which led to a lot of lapses and then and an ineffective public health policy. So poor economic and fiscal response, as well as allegation of corruption, are some of the things that have been unearthed in Liberia due to the impact of COVID-19. Next. The team learned that the following governance and policy intervention were instituted in Liberia. So we learned that there was a 6-month nationwide state of emergency lockdown and a launch of a 25 billion stimulus package. Fiscal loan offset program were also instituted. Internal and international travel restrictions were imposed. There were border closure and then mandatory screening and testing, as well as vaccination, were also instituted. The government had a temporary expansion of the Liberia Social Safety Net project. These are lists of some governance and policy interventions that the team learned were instituted by the government. Next. For this research, the team will employ a case study technique. And the case here is the case of Liberia. And then the team will use quantitative and qualitative data means of data collection. Stakeholder consultations will be held. Key informant interview and focus group discussions will also be held. So various stakeholder will come from a different sector of the country. So both government, NGOs, and community, and key informants will also come from these sectors as well. And based on identified and listed, well-listed and developed characteristics, focus group discussion will be held. Next. At the end of the research, if this research is conducted, we envisage the following impact. First, that the research will have a huge impact on preventive mitigation, and that the research will also have an impact on preparing the country for post-pandemic era. And the research will have very rich lessons that we as least developed countries in Liberia can learn from in terms of policy implementation, both successes and failures. The research is also going to have a very significant impact on how community organize as a form of resilience to buttress national efforts, and then new insights on inclusive multi-sectoral approach and its positive gains when it comes to disaster governance, and some of the impact this research is going to have, governance transformations during periods of public health crisis, also some of the impact that this research is going to have if it is conducted. Next. Additional impact include this research being used as a tool to influence political and government accountability through public exposure of COVID-19 information, and as a tool to promote good governance through an emphasis on inclusive and grassroots participation of all stakeholders and actors within the governance sector during an outbreak. These are some of the impact that the research is going to have if or when conducted. Next. This is the team that have designed this research proposal. My name is Ms. Crystal Zobo Koputolo. I have a Master of Arts degree in Development Studies. I'm the principal investigator on this research proposal, and I'm working along with my colleague, Ms. Lucille Yapelele, who has a Master of Science degree in Environmental Science. Collectively, we work as research fellows or consulting at a think tank in Liberia called the Center for Strategic Research and Policy Review. Next. I'll end by highlighting additional impact and potential that this research has and why this research should be funded. First, it is the first research that will be conducted within the area of pandemic governance. As of now, the team is yet to locate research that have been conducted in Liberia in the area of pandemic governance, looking at challenges and lessons learned. Secondly, this research is employing a holistic approach, which means a lot of new information, a lot of new details, a lot of new ideas, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of sources, a lot of challenges are going to be Earth. Because we're taking the research from the very beginning. That's from the process of the outbreak of COVID to the containment and to this very, very present stage. So it's going to be in thorough investigation and thorough details and thorough digging deep in thorough case study of the entire process of the outbreak to this very end. Research is going to explore key governance issues, issues of public participation, issues of accountability, issues of how these policies were developed in response to the rule of law. The research is going to look at governance from that area and how it was applied within the COVID-19 pandemic and governance policies era. This research is going to be a building block. So because it is first of its kind in Liberia, additional research can be made on it. And also information and data from the research conducted in Liberia could be employed, both in terms of lessons and challenges to other least developed countries. The research is also going to present new insights on the challenges and lessons that we have learned, given the history Liberia have of outbreaks and diseases, and how the country, irrespective of how vulnerable it is, have been able to organize both as a community and then on a national level to contain the outbreak and eventually put an end to the outbreak, as in the case of Ebola. This research is going to dig deep into that landscape. What can we learn from a multi-sectoral approach? What can we learn from community organizing? What can we learn from governance, disaster governance in Liberia, and present these new findings and make some recommendations on how these findings could be employed in other least developed countries. Thank you very much for listening. I will now pause and take questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And of course, I forgot to mention that the team is based at the Center for Strategic Policy and Research in Liberia, and now we'll be taking questions. Just a couple of reminders, housekeeping kind of information. So for everybody who's connected, feel free to ask questions through the Q&A. Let's please focus on constructive questions. There's an anonymous user who's expressing very strong opinions. Let's just focus on questions for the teams. This is an open process still, so the jury is here to ask questions and decide on the value of the research. These are research projects, so these are not completed research pieces. So we're not presenting findings, but we are presenting research projects. And let's open the Q&A. I don't know if anyone in the jury wants to kick off with a question. Francisco, please give the floor.
Thanks very much. And Ms. Gordopolo, thank you for your presentation and your very interesting project. I have basically two questions. One is, you have quite a broad area of interest here, because you mentioned the effects of the pandemic you say, how has COVID-19 transformed Liberia's policy landscape in the areas of education, health, and social welfare? So I wonder if you could tell us more about the specific variables that you'll be looking at, and in particular, how they will be elicited, how information will be collected in this household survey of approximately 400 households in a fairly restricted area, I understand, in Montserrado County and Nimba County, right? So what are the variables? How will you be collecting information on them? And then what is the sort of identification strategy you're going to use to understand the interplay between the pandemic and different forms of governance, right? So I guess what we're trying to learn is aspects of governance in Liberia and how COVID interacted with that in affecting these outcomes. So could you tell us a little bit more about your research design for eliciting that information? Thank you.
Let's just collect maybe a couple more questions. So Alina first, and then Onosan.
Yes, thank you so much for having us here, and thank you for the presenters from the Liberia team. It was very exciting to hear about the project. I had a question that follows up a little bit on what Francisco was just asking, because in the proposal that I had the privilege to read, there's a mention there about the important sort of interconnections between healthcare, public education, and social services. And forgive me if I missed this, but I don't think I heard anything during the presentation itself. So I was wondering why these three sectors and what kinds of interconnections or linkages you will be interested in looking at, and why that is important, which apparently has not been the case up to now. Thank you.
Onosan. Thank you, Alina. You're muted. You're muted, Onosan. Can you unmute?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for very interesting, important the research. I also maybe have a similar related question regarding your research question, which is about how has COVID-19 transformed the policy landscape in various areas. Do you have any specific maybe hypothesis you are thinking about to maybe link up with this COVID and also various maybe variables and also institutional kind of aspects of the policy landscape? This is my first question. And then second question, that because Liberia has already experienced the Ebola disease and you overcome. So based on that achievement or maybe lessons learned, is there any thinking you think you can bring in this analysis of the COVID impact in policy landscape? This is my second question.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Adebayo.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would not repeat those questions that resonate with me, except to first thank Crystal and colleague. A lot of what I read and heard is very familiar to the conversations which we have been having on the continent on the immediate and longer term consequences of the pandemic on governance and public policy, including citizen rights, especially during the lockdown period. My question, therefore, probably connecting with the others in a slightly different way, is to ask you essentially that given all that we know about the initial conditions with the health sector in Liberia, and you describe it quite well, is there any reason to expect any different kind of preparedness response to the pandemic as we witnessed it, and in the way in which you presented it in the proposal? Thank you.
Okay, and there's also a question from the audience, a very clear question: governance at what level? Back to you, Crystal. We have about 8 minutes. Not much time for a lot of questions, but answer the questions you prefer. in the order you prefer, ideally all questions.
Thank you very much, judges, for the question. I will, from the since I noted that down, and if I got clearly what the question was, he's asking about what new governance structure we might expect or governance at what level from the audience. So governance within this research, we're looking at governance both at the level that talks about transparency, accountability, public participation, and respect to the rule of law. So how are these policies are being formulated at national level when it comes to coordinating disease control and disaster management in the country? How do they situate within the principle of public participation, transparency with regard to rule of law? So, and also at the very minute level within the community. So we're looking at national level, and we're also looking at community level, but with those key principles playing through the entire policy formulation process and response process to disaster management or disease governance in Liberia. So for the last question from the judges, what new thing we think this research is going to show up when it comes to coordination is that we observe in Liberia that most of the coordination, they are not done holistically, so they're kind of sporadic. It is like small efforts going around, and people do not join the link towards how can we make it stronger, how can we improve it. So like everyone starts to do everything, the place is a bit chaotic, and government is bringing this out, and another person is bringing this out. So how can these efforts, even within the government, sometimes the policies are not even coordinated. So one new key issue that the research intends to find out and share as a lesson learned is how can we make these efforts more coordinated. So a lot is going on, but because they're not coordinated, people don't get to know, and the impact is not really felt within the country. For the for the question on variables, so within our research, the variables we're looking at are participation, new elected policies, and how GOL have been able to follow up on some of these issues. So what are some of the new variables? What are some of the issues that came up with participation? So when the government formulated these policies, where the public, they did take into consideration some issues about public participation, how involved the public were, and some of the policies that were elected, why were they elected, and what are some of the shortages that happened, and some of the key challenges they face that these challenges, these issues got elected. And we will be using survey as a form of data collection. So we know it's 500 participants we have at GDAC set within the research proposal, and one medium we'll be using is a survey questionnaire. So we're going to develop questionnaire for participant based on these variables. So these variables are going to guide, the variables I just listed are going to guide how we will develop the question and what kind of stakeholders we want to be having our focus group discussion, in our key informant interview, and in our community-based discussion that we will be having. So I'm trying to catch up on some of the questions.
So there's another question from Alina on the link. Why these three sectors, and what do you expect to find in terms of a link? And then a question on the hypothesis you're trying to answer, and any lessons from the Ebola, the research on the Ebola crisis.
So lessons from the Ebola crisis. One of the key lessons we learned was community organizing and how it's important for effort to be holistic. Because Liberia, given how vulnerable the country is, the government cannot deal with all of the issues when disaster has this strike. So there are no pre-prepared plans ahead of time, like if this happens, we'll do this. And sometimes, although those plans can be altered, but at least having it on board is important, but we do not have that. So some of the lessons we've learned from Ebola is, and it's very key, is that the community build this resilience, make them multifaceted and buttress government efforts. So it's not only on government. We have a very good lesson from how these mechanisms work at a very minute and lower level within the country. And we saw that also playing through within COVID, because it's always like we have to help ourselves when these diseases start in the country. And we try to, what we're doing right now, testing the hypothesis of how this entire issue, how disaster within Liberia. Sorry, can you hear me? We try, we do it. The question that is really about how can these things, if they are coordinated, if they are not correctly, if we have this plan situated post COVID or disaster governance plan, if we have community mechanism set, then can this, if this coordinated disaster frame, instead of when we have these policies all together, instead of, can this help us mitigate the loss of lives that we usually sustain as a country? So, for example, in during the Ebola outbreak, we had none of these. Even as of now, we had none. And then Liberia, then not being an epicenter, had to bear a burn of it, because we have these porous borders and we have no information sharing. We have no good border surveillance. We have no coordinated effort. We have not learned our lessons yet when it comes to community organizing, etc., etc. So if we do all of these things within this research, if we develop it and come up with solutions that will have impact on this, can they help us that next time, maybe when the next disease comes, within the governance sector, where we see more coordinated efforts, where we see more interscope of community, national, and then international, and then at the governance level, with its help and strengthening and make the country to be less vulnerable and be able to respond effectively when disease has struck. Could you please repeat the last question for me, Ms.
Whose question? You remember who? Because you started from the last question. So whose question is it that you?
From Chika, from Azumi. I guess I haven't responded to that yet.
I think my question was responded. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it was, yes. Yeah, but there's another question. There's another question from the audience in terms of what model you're going to use to integrate all sectors, I suppose. If there is a model.
Yeah, that's why, like, are we having, because for the proposal, and as of now, we've thought about the research methodology we will apply. We thought about the case. We thought about the variables. We thought about the governance level. We thought about how we want to situate this entire research into how we look at governance within this research. And then it's not a defined shape frame model as of now that we have or such of that. But we, as a case study, we're looking both at all levels. That's what we can say for sure. So it's quite quantitative and qualitative in its design, and it's going to have a participant focus group discussion. That's how we're going to collect our data. But the team is here to come up with a clearly defined research models, which we put it into. But it's going to be a bit of piece. Or mixture of base. Someone would say mixed method of base, but yeah, it's not a clearly defined model as of this time that the team has developed. Just ways in which we will collect our data and issues around how we will identify the data we want.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. I know this is frustrating. It's very little time to discuss the project, but you know, this went through several levels of peer review and And of course, the jury members have seen the full proposal, right? Just to let the audience know that the presentation is just the last step, is not the only step in the selection process. And some of this question will have, of course, to be answered during the implementation of the projects, obviously. But let's move to our next. Thank you very much, Christoph, for your answers and for your presentation. Let's move on to the next finalist. So we have Mrs. Shabana Khan from the Indian Research Academy, of course, in India. We're presenting the project titled Assessing Infodemic in the Post-COVID-19 Risk Communication and Governance. Please, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Hello everyone. Our research project is about assessing infodemic in the post-COVID-19 risk communication and governance. I received the message you see on the screen on my WhatsApp. If you look at it, you find that the picture is not of Einstein. He did not invent electricity, and the internet was also not available for public use at his time. As the average attention span on social media is less than 2.5 seconds, many of us may not understand the message fully in this time. But the cost of misinterpretation seems insignificant for such message as it relates to general knowledge. However, the cost could be very extreme, and in fact, the situation can get out of the control when people misunderstand the risk communication of a real-time hazard. This is what happened after the declaration of COVID-19 pandemic in India. On 24th March 2020, the Prime Minister of India called for a nationwide lockdown for the next 21 days. People were advised to follow social distancing and not to move out of their home to control the transmission of coronavirus. On the next day, thousands of daily wage laborers and migrant workers from megacities like Delhi and Mumbai started walking on their foot to their hometowns in large numbers. As you can see, there was no social distancing. People had to walk for hundreds of kilometers, and many of them died on their way. Unintentionally, these people also became the carriers of coronavirus to distant and rural areas. So why this happened? Infodemic emerges from excessive and hazardous risk communication that arouses fear, hatred, confusion, and many other negative emotions that may lead to suicide, violence, or even violation of human rights. It is not that people did not understand what was said to them, but in our traditional model of top-down risk communication, often the diverse need of exposed population do not get addressed. The declaration of the lockdown meant that people now had to lose their jobs. They had no money to pay for their rent or feed their families, and they had to survive another month in a megacity with limited support system. It led to sudden spike in concerns related with work, money, disease, treatment, and so on, which were communicated through multiple channels on social media. Not every information shared was wrong, but information out of context can become misinformation for others. The technological solution applied in terms of tracking, checking, and removing misinformation were also inadequate for growing concerns and social media users on multiple platforms and channels. There was also inadequate research to support the governance of risk communication in case of infodemic, which would also vary for different hazards. In our previous study, we assessed risk communication and community engagement for COVID-19. We classified the nature of risk communication experienced across different countries into three broad categories of infodemic, ideal, and inadequate risk communication. We found that both excessive and even inadequate risk communication had negative social impact. Infodemic certainly caused much more damage and affected several countries. So for this study, we chose to assess infodemic further in depth for three selected countries of Bangladesh, India, and United Kingdom. For this research, we have outlined 4 research questions, which mainly look into how does the process of risk communication vary for general and crisis situation? How did respective governments manage the issue of infodemic and its impact on different vulnerable groups? Which were the key gaps and differences in the policies applied for managing COVID-19 across the 3 countries? and what are the best practices and strategies that can be adopted for post-COVID-19 risk communication and governance. This project is also relevant for global policies. In our previous study, we assessed 3 major global agreements that address disaster risk. These include Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. We found that even though they talk about risk and communication, they pay little attention to the process of risk communication. The content analysis of these documents shows that risk communication term doesn't appear even once. These documents, however, do focus on warning, damage, and loss to facilitate information sharing and cooperation across nations. In contrast, the local risk communication is quite complex, with multiplicity of risk, diverse stakeholders, and factors which influence risk perception as well as communication. The study is also relevant for Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations notes that COVID-19 has reversed years of progress that has been made inside this program. Inadequate risk communication can be found across the 17 goals, and out of 17, only 4 goals converge when they talk about risk and the interlinkages. The project has become even more important in the post-COVID-19 phase because of increasing complexity of information sharing and concerns. There are several reasons for it. One of them is increasing number of hazards and nature of information shared because of unknown character of intensifying climate change and emerging variants of COVID-19. We also have political use of fake news now. There is increasing use of AI and internet for crimes. Also, there is a very slow process of policy change, particularly in the developing countries. And we have seen that the most vulnerable group often become both the agent and victims of infodemic. This is the current state of COVID-19 worldwide, according to WHO, which shows that India and UK both fall in the category of highest number of COVID cases in comparison to Bangladesh, which falls in the second category. We have noted that the impact, response, and outcome of infodemic vary significantly across these 3 countries, which have been studied in isolation but not collectively. On the one hand, these countries share a connected history of colonial rule and administrative system. They differ significantly in their population composition, development, use of technology, response culture, and policy context. The study would thus bring diverse examples and solutions which are not only relevant for these countries, but many other which share similar profile. For this research, we have adopted mixed method approach for a lateral as well as in-depth analysis. We will begin with literature review, leading to infodemic mapping across 3 countries, and then we will proceed with key stakeholder interviews and roundtable discussion. And finally, we will be reporting the outcome in academic and public domain. We have 3 women as the core research team members for this project. I am Dr. Shabana Khan from India. I am a geographer and also the principal investigator for this project. Then we have Dr. Jyoti Mishra, who is an associate professor and also deputy director of AIMTech Research Center at the University of Leeds. Her research expertise is in the domain of information management and technology. We also have Dr. Noa Ahmed, who is a professor of University of North-South in Bangladesh, and her research expertise is in the domain of human-computer interaction. So we have key technical expertise which is required to assess the infodemic for this project. In terms of our strength, we are a multidisciplinary team with a researcher based in each of the selected study sites. We have over a decade of research experience in the domain of risk communication. Collectively, we have published over 15 papers, and we also hold international credibility as 2 of our members are World Social Science Fellows, 2 are the alumni of Global Young Academy, and 2 are also associate editors in the international peer-reviewed journals on related themes. In terms of potential impact, the project will address infodemic through an integrated and inclusive risk communication. It will therefore have both theoretical and practical implications. The project will result into policy engagement through interviews and roundtable discussions with key stakeholders, including government and non-government organizations, policy experts, and several other international key stakeholders. It will also identify pathways and strategies based on key gaps and best practices observed across 3 selected countries and various international organizations. This research will also sensitize the needs of diverse vulnerable groups to avoid infodemic during risk communication. And finally, by addressing the issues of infodemic in risk communication, the research will also contribute towards reducing the damage which happened due to infodemic. Finally, we would like to close with a message that creating safety shouldn't cost lives and livelihood. More than 8,700 people died on the railway track in 2020. Many of these were migrants who were walking back home for the survival. Many of these lives, along with many others which lost due to several other causes but related to infodemic, could have been saved. And this research is a step forward in that direction. We are truly grateful to GDN and all the judges for giving us a chance to present our case and also listening to this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shabana and team. And I think we can just open the floor for questions, of course, also from the audience. Who would like to start? Ono-san, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to and also reading your proposals. It's a very much timely and also innovative research, I think. I have maybe 2 questions. The first question is about the your understanding of the key factors which could make success full management of this that information, risk information. You talked about that as an ideal risk communication, Sweden and also New Zealand. Maybe based on your literature review at this moment, can you tell us about what are the maybe your hypothesis of the maybe common aspect which could maybe contribute to the better risk communication, and also what are the maybe country differences? Because I thought this would be related to your maybe research question and also methodologies. Second question is that you talked about that the mapping infodemic scenario at the first place. Could you explain a little bit more about these methodologies? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Next is Adebayo.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Shabana. I very much enjoyed reading and also listening. And as I read and listened, I placed myself back in Senegal, where I was located at the time of the pandemic. And I lived through the lockdown during that entire period. And just like Izumi's question, one of the things that kept recurring to me is the state of trust between government and citizen, which basically broaches upon the question of what you consider to be some of the prior conditions in state-society relations that could affect the nature and impact of infodemics. Secondly, it seemed to me that much of the implicit assumption is of infodemics emanating largely from the top, from above, from government. And yet, a lot of the information which seemed to shape choices and preferences actually came from fake news and a lot of informal sources of information. including even assumptions about the nature of the vaccinations proposed and what they were likely to do to the human physiology and so on and so forth. And although I don't see any direct difference between a developing country and developed country context in this regard, we know that in the less developed countries, there was a lower uptake, all other factors considered, of the vaccinations that were available. And this partly had to do with the kinds of information that people chose to believe, even in spite of assurances from government. So how do you factor in alternative infodemics, if I might call it that way, that emanates from sources other than the official public health or governmental sources of information? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francisco, you're next.
Thanks very much, Dr. Khan, and to you and your team for a very interesting proposal, a very nice presentation. My question is, so you're going to look at these risk communication strategies in these three countries. Is the idea basically to document what these strategies and policies were? Or is it also to look at their differential impact on outcomes? And if it is the latter, to look also at the impact on outcomes, how will you be able to assess those impacts? In the case of India, you know, when you mentioned the announcement by the Prime Minister and then the immediate consequences, it's relatively straightforward. But it could be much harder in the sense of, for example, how did the UK government or the Bangladeshi government lead with misinformation on the internet and so on. So, so it's basically, is it about documenting or is it about establishing impact? And if so, how so? Thank you.
Thank you, Alina.
Yeah, thank you very much again for a really excellent presentation. And once again, my question is closely related to what Francisco in particular has just asked about. It seems that there's sort of an implicit or perhaps more explicit link being made between the infodemic and the loss of human life. And I was just trying to understand, you know, perhaps what are the hypotheses that you are testing? And I'm assuming that the idea behind the research is not only to describe in the way that Francisco was saying, but also to sort of understand what the impact of disinformation or of the infodemic has been in terms of people's ability to respond to the crisis and be resilient. I'm also curious to know why these three countries, obviously they do share some historical connections, but they're also very different, as you were saying. And I'm trying to understand what it is about these three countries that you hope will bring to light some insights that may have been missed or what have you. So thank you.
Great. Shaban, after you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Francisco, for coordinating it. And I'll begin with Professor Izumi's comments. So in terms of countries, we assess like how countries have managed the risk communication as well as public response. And Sweden and New Zealand somehow managed to inform public in advance as well. And versus we looked into Iran and Italy, where initially there was very less information available, and that's caused a lot of damage in the public domain. So basically the hypothesis that we are looking into it, like often warning is seen as one-time public information, like we give a warning that this hazard is coming and people will respond in a similar way. And that is what also results into infodemic. Versus warning is mainly people have diverse information need. And if it is, if they are well prepared in advance, as we also saw in case of New Zealand, like people were already knew that they need to prepare in order to deal with this pandemic. So people were given time to go to their places wherever they can go to protect themselves in case of a longer period of lockdown. But in India, it was like so there was a declaration of lockdown, and people next day thought like they have to leave the city. So those kind of situation actually creates problem. So what we are saying is warning is not one time information provision. Rather, it is also the trust building process, as Eva Rio just mentioned. Like, it's not just like you give warning and everyone respond in a different way, because now we have so many evidence as well. Different people respond to the same information in a different way. So people freeze, people flight, people fight, but we expect everyone to behave in a certain way, which doesn't work at times. So that is our main hypothesis, I would say. In terms of infodemic mapping, what we are looking is like comparing what happened in the first year of pandemic. So we will be using the national newspapers online basically, and also maybe using the GIS tools and descriptive statistical techniques, mainly to identify what were the key issues which were causing infodemic, and what were the response both at the public end as well as on the government end as well. And assessing the whole scenario across the 3 different countries, because I think even though there is not much, in many cases, the issues of infodemic were same, but the response actually varied quite significantly. For example, social distancing in many cases difficult, but in slums, it definitely cannot be followed. So that was a very tough situation in many of the slum cities in India as well as in Bangladesh as well. So we also want to bring the concern, what were the concern that people really failed and they could not manage, and they really needed support at that time. So also, so that was one of the things we wanted to bring. And as Francisco asked, like, is it about just documenting and also looking the differential impact? So we are doing both the things. So we will be definitely looking into how these different kind of infodemic or different issues of infodemic affected people, and how people responded, and what action also government took to address those. And I think there is one more. Adabio also said that there is an implicit assumption about top-down infodemic. So we are not saying that infodemic happened either from because of the information, the way it is said to them, but it is more about, of course, there are some anti-social elements which tend to put the fake news as well, but that is not always the case. So many people, in many cases, for people, it worked out like that, people had some warm water and it worked for them. And then they started sharing, but for many other, it did not work out. For some people, they shared that alcohol saves against COVID-19. So people also actually drank sanitizers, and that caused infodemic. And few people actually lost life because of that in India. And then there was a lot of attack in India because on people who were having pets, or the people who were the sanitary workers or doctors, and many of them happened because of loss of trust as well. And the trust building process cannot just happen in one warning or in one step. Like, it need a process of constantly engaging public and establishing trust that this is, of course, it's a difficult time, and whatever the concern they have, it can be managed over time. So of course we are not at this time, we haven't completed the project, so we cannot give what should be the final solution, but we want to identify what were the best practices which actually worked. And of course, the situation between developed and developing countries are very different, and sometimes resource challenges are also different. So the method would differ, but also there is a lot that these countries can also learn from each other. So why we selected 3 countries, as Alina asked, is like, one reason is, of course, because we 3 researchers are based in these countries. So we have a greater exposure and access to what actually happened in these countries as well. And by far, we have a lot of cases, like when we were writing the previous paper, we found a lot of infodemic cases happen. And it was not just because of one sort of fake news or one sort of issue. There are quite a few different issues which happened, right? If the issues were relating to religion, the issues were relating to social distancing, or like relating to alcohol, relating to services, pets, and all of them. So we want to actually go further in deep in the area where actually we do have access to the data as well, and the people and the scenarios. We wanted to look further in depth, and of course, because many other countries were also affected by infodemic, including US and many other countries that we had also in the previous study, like Malaysia was also affected. But because we had limited budget for this project and we were looking for how effectively we can assess this topic, so we chose these 3 countries. And of course, it can be expanded if in future, we never know. So I think I have addressed all the questions.
We've just a couple of minutes left, and there's a comment that is in the chat. Please, people in the audience, just use the Q&A judiciously. But there's a comment that I think implies an interesting question. What is the link to governance? How do you see the link to governance in your research?
Yeah, so we see a direct link with the disaster governance, because the whole idea of the risk communication is to manage the situation where people can be protected from the hazard. And in disaster, the whole intention is to have the minimum loss. But what happened when in this disaster, when warning is generated, we end up having much more damage because of people not understanding the risk communication, and then they were responding in a way which was causing much more damage in certain cases. So if the violence erupts, then it causes much more damage. When so many people suddenly leave the cities in India, so suddenly there was a shortage of labor, and who are not available to work. So there are many ways, the governance get impacted, and also there is a trust in governance also get decreased when people are directly impacted by a risk as well as infodemic. So in this way, we see quite a few interlinkages with the governance and infodemic, and the way risk was communicated and responded as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can come to a close. So thank you, Shaban. I think for everybody's answer. We need to. I'm sorry, but we need to move to the next presentation, the final presentation by the 3rd finalist. So we'll be listening to Hakimu Seviri. I'm probably mispronouncing your name, so please correct me. So Hakimu is based at the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University and at the Makerere University Center for Climate Change Research and Innovation in Kampala, Uganda. And the title of the project is Strengthening Urban Land Conflict Management and Tenure Security in Post-COVID Land Governance, Experiences, and Lessons from Lusanja, Informal Settlement in Kampala City, Uganda. 50 minutes, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hakim Seviri. I'm a researcher at the Makerere University Urban Action Lab and Center for Climate Change Research and Innovations. I'm here to present our project titled Strengthening Urban Land Conflict Management and Tenure Security in Post-COVID-19 Land Governance, Experiences and Lessons Drawn from Lusanja Informal Settlement, Kampala City, Uganda. Just to give an overview of Kampala City, this is a city with over 1.5 million people and one of the fastest growing city with an annual population growth rate of 4.03%. The city contributes to over 60% of the national gross domestic product and acts as the commercial, governance and industrial hub for Uganda. The city has a large informal sector with over 60% being informal settlements and about 80% of the urban economy being informal. And finally, it's heterogeneous in nature, comprising of diverse ethnicities due to migrations from different parts of the country and the refugee influx from the Greater Horn of Africa. To zero down on the project problem, which is land tenure and property rights, I present 2 images. One on the left is an image scene of an equal urban form separated by Nagro Drive in Kampala City, and on the left we have an image of Kampala City landscape morphology that shows the configurations of hills, valleys, wetlands, water, and so forth. Now, when one looks at the image on the left, where we have an equal urban form, one thinks of urban inequality, urban poverty, infrastructure and services deficiency, planning issues, and so forth. And what we see on the left is the reality manifested across the entire Kampala city, as we see it composing of hills and valleys and other sorts of ecologically sensitive areas. Now, the question that we always ask ourselves is, how did we get here? And this is where the issue of land tenure and property rights comes in. We see urban growth and expansion happening at a high rate, but there is reduced space availability to allow this, and yet the interest within urban land continue to increase day in, day out. There is more demand for land for settlements, demand for land for commercial buildings, establishments, demand for land for infrastructure development, demand for land for expanding the urban economy, and also ecological conservations. But on this land, which is limited, transactions tend to happen at local level, and yet formal land administration structures, governance systems, and policies have failed to keep pace with what is evolving within the localized land transactions. We see multiple emerging interest in land, multiple emerging tenure arrangements, multiple emerging land markets, which are not catered for in formal systems, and these have tended to result into evictions and dispossessions of majorly urban poor from land, because what they think is their property by their means is not what is stipulated in policies, is not what is stipulated in legal frameworks and so forth. And yet, when we try to engage in talks, debates, and discussions on land issues within informal settlements, and specifically for the urban poor, the topic seems alien to them because they seem not to be engaged enough, or if it exists, to discuss issues related to land tenure security and property rights. In other words, the system seems to be operating for the rich and disenfranchising the poor. When you look at the tenure context pre-COVID-19, we see that about 60% of the informal settlements in Kampala are situated on land whose ownership is contested. Some are located on land which is claimed by more than one parties. Some are located on land which is located in ecologically sensitive areas, and others have multiple ownership rights from different entities and acknowledged by different authorities. So amidst such a context, there is widespread tenure insecurity and property rights threats, and yet there is limited policy and legal options to see that their rights are protected. Rising cases of land tenure conflicts and evictions were witnessed pre and during the COVID-19 situation, where specifically land offices were not operative, where urban governance offices, most of them dealing with the development control, were not active, since these were suspended to avoid exposure and vulnerability, increasing vulnerability to the COVID-19 virus. And as land conflicts and evictions rise, these threaten livelihoods, infrastructure development, local economic development, planning and service provisions, as well as urban inequality. When we look at the context of land tenure during the COVID period, violent evictions and tenure security threats were more pronounced during this period, and we saw more illegal housing units and commercial buildings being established because there was limited development control and there were no individuals or officials in charge of ensuring that whoever is building a land on land is building on the rightfully owned land, and they are using the established standards in setting up their infrastructure. Although few legal directives existed, like suspension of evictions on land and protection of the poor, but these were often temporary and not clear on how they could support or disenfranchise the urban poor. So it's those who had access to power and authority who would quickly do the evictions, and yet the poor had no directions on where to head to, on where to seek solutions and to seek their voice to be heard. And as the situation is, there is need for new solutions and policy shifts or pathways to secure land tenure security and property rights for the urban poor if we are to achieve inclusive resilience and sustainable urban development. We therefore propose fundamental debates and policy engagement across all stakeholders to generate evidence-based decisions for securing property and tenure rights. And while doing this, the most vulnerable should be at the forefront: the women, the children, people with disabilities, people living in informal settlements, and so forth. We also propose an investigation or research about the Lusanja land conflict events and processes in Kampala City, and also harness that knowledge on locally grounded initiatives and lessons for post-COVID-19 land security and rights protections. That will again lead us into co-creation of opportunities for tenure security policy innovations aimed at unlocking the contemporary rigidities within conventional tenure systems, property rights policies, and urban land markets. Our research question is what has been the implication of COVID-19 pandemic on enduring land conflict and tenure security in low-income settings. And specifically, we shall conduct a spatio-temporal biograph of events and processes in the Lusanja land conflict, that is before, during, and after the pandemic. We shall also determine livelihood losses and damages from the Lusanja settlement evictions and explore pandemic effects on the evicted persons. We shall also analyze strategies for securing land tenure rights amongst evicted persons at Lusanja settlements, and finally explore opportunities for informal land tenure security and property rights acquisition within the wider post-COVID-19 land governance systems at all levels. We shall use a participatory approach in implementing this project, and this shall involve community dialogues, involving community members and leaders, as well as early career researchers in data collections, as well as appreciating other contemporary urban challenges facing cities. We shall institute a steering committee that will involve policymakers, academicians, civil society, and local governance structure leaders to guide the entire project cycle, and also initiate or encourage policy engagement through this steering committee. The project shall draw on qualitative and quantitative methods that will include literature review, surveys, focus group discussions and dialogue, spatial assessment, and a biography of conflict and conflict resolution processes at the Lusanja land conflict. The key impacts envisaged by our project are raising awareness through knowledge products like technical reports, blogs, policy briefs, research articles, and blogs, building capacities through engaging communities and career researchers in data collection, sensitization during the dissemination workshop, and the trainings attached to it. We shall also stimulate policy dialogues at local, city, and national levels, and this shall leverage on the existing settlement forums, city forums, and national forums to engage on policy issues at different levels. Stakeholder consultations shall be conducted, and as well as evidence dissemination shall also stimulate policy dialogues. We shall finally seek engagements with networks like the Cities Alliance, African Cities Research Consortium, Slum Dwellers Internationals, and local urban poor collectives to initiate uptake of evidence as an opportunity to push for policy shifts or pathways to secure land tenure and property rights for the urban poor. The project shall be implemented by me as the principal investigator and Mrs. Viola Wahereza as the co-investigator. And finally, our vision is to have a city where everyone has a right to space, an eviction-free city, and inclusive urban life for all persons, regardless of their income, gender, among others. Then ultimate security and protection of the urban poor on tenure and property rights issues is also what we envision. And finally, increased evidence policy engagement and policy outcomes on land tenure and property rights issues in Kampala and developing countries at large. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Akimo. I think we can open the floor for questions, both from the jury and from the audience. Who would like to start? Francisco, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very interesting proposal and presentation. In your written proposal on page 7, you say that you're going to conduct an event-based analysis of this Lusanja land conflict. And that seems interesting. You also detail how you're going to collect the data, including through these questionnaires, this 200 questionnaire survey fielded in Lusanja. Now, my question is, for an event, if by event-based analysis you mean the sort of event study that we normally look at, typically people have a whole bunch of data points, right, before and after, to sort of try and see if the event had a big impact. But if you're collecting the household survey data just once, how do you plan to have that kind of data, or are you using geospatial data instead, on which you have a time series? So I just wanted to understand whether you meant an event study, and if so, do you have the sort of time series of data for that? That's question 1. And question 2 is, you really have 2 events, right? You have the eviction in 2018, and you have the pandemic in early 2020. Are you assessing the joint impact of those 2 events? Or are you trying to ascertain differential impacts from each event? And if so, how would you separate them? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I would also like to continue on that methodological line, because it seemed to me that it's a study which would lend itself to a longitudinal approach in gathering evidence and data and the like. But all the more so for me, because what you describe for Lusanja is also true, I think, for most other urban and peri-urban settlements in the context of the rapid transformation which we are witnessing across the African continent. Transformation driven partly, as you noted, by growth in population, but also by what you call for partly, which is the land titling in which individuals not only get deeds from government, but also increasingly from an open market. And the expansion of the private land market in Africa, I think, is one of the most interesting dynamics in the land sector, which we see today. So I'm really struggling a bit, Hakimu, with what you propose based on the objectives you define to seek to do and secure land rights for everybody in a context in which, in fact, quote unquote, land privatization and individualization through titling has become an almost irreversible dynamic in which those who ultimately emerge victorious, so to speak, are those who have the means and the resources to do so, and not necessarily those who dwell in high density settlements that become increasingly prized as cities expand beyond their original boundaries. Secondly, I have a feeling that there's a gap between the objectives which you define for the project and the impact, the 4 impact areas which you then highlighted. It seems to me that there's a bit of a decalage, a gap between them. I'm not seeing a direct connection, and it may be good for you to just share with us how those relate more closely to the objective that you define. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ono-san.
Thank you very much. My question is related to maybe Francisco's the second questions. After reading your proposal, I thought you were trying to identify or analyze the impact of COVID on impact of the COVID based on what happened. Okay, so yeah, you are trying to analyze the impact of the COVID based on the kind of result, consequence of eviction in 2018. So how those consequences of eviction has been worsened because of the COVID. Am I right? I also try to understand what is the relationship between eviction in 2018 and also this COVID. And for example, you talked about the difficulty in having access to legal services or consultations. So I think those are the difficulties that those residents or people have faced because of the COVID, because of the social distances, lack of those kind of human based consultation. But this was kind of result of the eviction. So may I understand that you are trying to analyze how this eviction has in 2018 was worsened because of the COVID? This is my question. And also how those are related to the governance, maybe that questions, yeah.
Maybe you can, Akimu, you can start answering, and then as questions come in, we can do a second round if needed.
All right, thank you for listening to my presentations, and thank you for the questions. I'll begin with the questions raised by Jury Francisco, where he questioned an event-based analysis and having a questionnaire and geospatial assessment where time series need to be captured. Right, to kind of explain the scenario at Rusanja, it's kind of a complex experience whereby claims of land began between two parties, a private actor and the community since 2018, and that's when the private actor secured a court order to evict these people. And through 2018, 2019, 2020, when COVID set in, there were struggles for the community to secure land, but this was compromised by little legal representation of the community into courts of law and the different administrative and land governance structures, which by the time the COVID-19 set in, the situation of the people evicted from the settlement worsened, which called the attention of the media, attention of the political representatives, and the attention of the president, who was at the epitome of COVID-19 crisis management. In fact, at one point, he visited the settlement when people were sleeping in structures made out of tarpaulins. So during that process, when the president visited, when the COVID-19 period set into the country, and that's when processes of tenuring, of gaining tenure security for the community began, because it had caught attention of the person who heads the country. So at this process, at this point, this is when we see the implications of COVID-19 hitting hard to the evicted population. And what we seek to do here is to map the series of events right from where claims of land ownership began through the evictions and implications. The survey is meant to assess the loss and damages of these people during the eviction, but also even when the president visited them, because after the president visiting, there was another smaller scale eviction for those who had put up some small structures where they could seek refuge. So we want to trace the losses and damages during that period. And currently, as we speak, there are ongoing processes to help communities secure tenure rights through the Uganda Land Fund, which is a fund which was created to ensure that people vulnerable to evictions and displacement are able to access such funds to pay for those who claimed ownership over land such that they remained in their particular spaces. But this has not been normally the case for the urban poor to gain access to such opportunity to access such land funds to clear their tenure rights. Then these are kind of connected issues, because we see the evictions before COVID-19, and then COVID-19 sets in, which worsens the livelihood of these individuals and opens an opportunity for them to begin advocating for securing their land, where we see a lot of actors coming into play, government actors, legal practitioners, civil society agencies, and the media trying to come up and air out their plight and the need for them to access funding from the Uganda Land Fund. Again, this takes me to the question by Judy Adebayo, where he questioned about the increasing privatization and individualization of land in urban space, where the rich or the one who has the higher pay takes it all and at the expense of the poor. Again, this points back to the existing land fund. The land fund was put in place to offer opportunities for those who are unable to clear tenure or to secure tenure within the urban space. And we see if we engage policymakers, if we engage stakeholders onto this matter, and we increase debates and discussions around this issue, we can increase urban poor access to land, to the land fund, even in the context where most of the land in the city is contested and being compromised by those with power. I saw a gap being highlighted between the objectives and impact. I would like to say that these two events are related because land governance is a key question across the country, and we are trying to initiate policy engagements at different levels, such that whatever is evolving at local level is taken up into the existing policy and governance structures. By governance, we mean the practices, decisions, and activities that are made to take decisions on land without compromising interests of whoever needs access to that land. In the end, if we secure tenure security for the urban poor, that's when we can realize local economic development. That's when we can realize effective urban planning and management. That's when we can extend urban infrastructure to the people. So this is not an isolated case, but a case that has provided a solution, a case whose solutions was provided by the coming of the pandemic in Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we are out of time, so we'll close the Q&A session now. Thanks again, Akimu, and of course, all the presenters, Christo and Shabana. Just to explain what happens next. Now the jury will actually meet separately, so in a private session. Let me just remind everyone what the criteria for the evaluation of the proposals are. So, of course, the jury will look at the total contribution the research makes to a specific aspect of development, which is the one highlighted very broadly in the call. The innovativeness of the research topic and the methodology, the quality of the academic quality of the proposal, right? So the link between the questions, the methodology, and the kind of data that the teams propose to use. But also the clarity and significance of the policy implications, so the policy relevance ultimately of the research questions that are being asked. Last but not least, the composition of the team and the appropriateness of the budget proposed for this. Just as a reminder, of course, there are 3 different kind of awards, 3 different grants with different kind of amounts attached to them. So the first prize winners, the prize winner will get $30,000 US, the second 20, and the third 10, which means that some of the projects might need to be resized in scope. Finally, there's also kind of the jury also takes into consideration the quality of the presentation and the interaction during the session, but that's more of an add-on kind of criteria than a fundamental one. Final reminder about the fact that the jury, in fact, can decide to award or not to award the prizes, and will decide in what order and how many of these awards will be given. The results will be announced next week. Right, so please join us tomorrow for the Most Innovative Development Project Award finals at the same time, and otherwise see you next week for the announcement of the winners. Thanks again to the jury and of course to the finalists, and thanks again to all of you who have joined us online. Have a great rest of the day.